sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So, greetings, Bhante, at Lokanta Vihara Monastery at the end of the world in Australia, and we're at Tamajarini Sonoma Mountain Bhikkhuni Arama here in Northern California, not to be confused with Southern California. So glad to get together today. We haven't seen one another for a long time, especially right with the pandemic situation. And here in the United States today, it is Earth Day. And we've been trying to get together and find a time and date that worked for a little while now. And it just turns out that we're meeting on Earth Day. So I was just thinking about this in connection with where you're at now, Bhante, the Lokanta Monastery at the end of the world, monastery at the end of the world. And I think some of our friends who might see this might not be familiar with it. And so I'm just going to see if it's possible to share that on screen for them. And, you know, just to acknowledge some of the things that are strong on our hearts these days. The circumstances with the pandemic, especially now we've been seeing with friends in India, even got news a few hours ago that 2 of our bhikkhunis there have died from the coronavirus, and the situation is seeming quite serious. And then also we have the situation in Myanmar, Burma on our hearts and minds. And here in the United States, wow, like crazy. The mass shootings have started up again, like more than one every day in the last month here. And I just feel so, I just really feel these things at heart and just want to acknowledge all that's going on. And of course, you know, so many kinds of suffering are in a way perennial. So whenever anyone sees this, even if years later, I'm sure there will be the difficult and things that are going on in various forms and various places. And so today we're getting together for a chat, and because we're having a Therigatha Festival. And one of the things that I love about the Therigatha is its have no holds barred attitude with regards to the various kinds of suffering in life. This is not pretend, and not like they all just had beautiful, fantastic merit and everything was daisies, and then they got enlightened and it was all love and light. And that was, so this is one of the things that I really love about it, is its down to earthness, and then also the power and strength of these voices of awakening amidst all of these suffering circumstances of life, no holds barred, with such an enormous variety of stories. So, Bhante, would you say a little something about, before we start talking about the Therigatha, would you like to say something about the Lokanta Vihara Monastery at the end of the world in light of Earth Day and all these things that are going on?
Well, thanks, Ayya. Yes, and I didn't know about those bhikkhunis who'd been afflicted with COVID in India. That's terrible. I remember that all those years ago in Bodh Gaya, when we met with many of the Indian bhikkhunis in some areas and taught some Vinaya for them. I'm wondering whether the bhikkhunis who passed away were among that group who we met in Bodh Gaya. I'm sure at least they would have been friends with them, but anyway. Yes, so here we are at the monastery at the end of the world, and I'm speaking on the land which is owned by the Baramadigal people of the Darug Nation. And for those of you who are not familiar with Australian customs, it's become customary in recent years to whenever a significant event is held, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and where possible to invite a member of the traditional owners, one of the Aboriginal people, to come and give a welcome to country, and to invite participation, or at very least to give an acknowledgement. And one of the things which on Earth Day is, of course, bear in mind, is that, well, we're all on this earth, the same earth that the Buddha was on, the same earth that you are on, Ayya, the same earth that I am on, and the same earth that the indigenous people cultivated, nurtured, and looked after for so many tens of thousands of years. And it's, if we think about how the role this plays in Buddhist iconography, remember the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, where the armies of Mara are dissipated when the Buddha calls the earth goddess to witness. And that's it's an element which is not found in the historical sources, but it was a kind of mythic archetype. But it shows the profound importance of that idea of the earth as being there as the bearer and the mother, who witnesses all of these things that we're doing. And we're going through a time of profound change and a profound challenge to our relationship to the earth. And if there's one thing which is undeniable about that, it's that we can't keep on doing what we have been doing. Something's got to give. And we either do that wisely, compassionately, carefully, or we do that with a gleeful, careening descent into chaos. That seems to be our choice. Let's see what happens. But yeah, very delightful to be able to have some words about Bhadda Kundalakesa. Now, Ayya, how are we going to approach this? How are we going to begin talking about Bhadda?
Well, Bhante, I just wanted to acknowledge, I'm noticing that you talked about the earth witness.
Right.
And I'm just noticing that the Buddha image behind your right shoulder there is in the earth witness posture, and the one here also on the other side of the world is likewise in the earth witness posture. So and to me, that's just so, that earth witness gesture is just so important. Right now, for us to sit in the earth witness gesture ourselves a lot.
There is an electric current that goes from the hand of the Buddhas down there and goes all the way to Sonoma, California. So
it's true, right? Somehow. So, Bhante, I wanted to mention the bhikkhunis in India. You were talking about the bhikkhunis, Indian bhikkhunis who were ordained in Bodh Gaya in 1998. Right. And then the Buddha Vision Bhikkhuni training that we offered more than 10 years ago together in Bodh Gaya. And I just wanted to share with you some news that I don't know if you heard before. Others might be interested, but as I emerged from winter retreat just a couple of weeks ago, I saw the news that in India, in Nagpur, they had a bhikkhuni ordination. And this, as far as I know, is the first time that those bhikkhunis were ordained in 1998 themselves served as the preceptors and the teachers for the women being ordained. So there have been the other bhikkhuni teachers and preceptors coming from afar who have served in these regards the last several times. And we've participated in offering training in person as well as supporting training subsequently over time. And I was just really glad to see that. And even during the time of COVID, this is before the second wave was rising up again, that they were able to ordain their own there in their land, in their area. So that was really, a cause of joy for me. So to share some of the joyful aspects amidst the grim, as the Therigatha also is so good for that. So my idea for this was having kind of a every few decades check-in, because some of the topics that I'm still working with myself looking into further are ones that we were researching and investigating so avidly at that time, around that time, from 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, leading up to the first Bhikkhuni ordination in Australia, and then 2010 here for the first dual Theravada Bhikkhuni ordination as well. And so I just thought to touch back in about a few of those things which we've both been looking into over the years, which you've written and published about. So I have a couple of different things that I hope to touch in about.
Very good. I thought would it be nice to begin with a reading of Bhadda's verses to set the scene?
Actually, it could be, and even before that, if possible, I wanted to share with you some of the very contemporary things that I've been just studying myself and looking into very, very briefly, just to share with you.
Okay, please go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so just yesterday or just today, depending upon how the time works out for you, it would be like, I think it would be just today, maybe, I don't know, for me, yesterday. So just recently, a friend of ours, Dr. Malai Uch of the Cambodian School of San Francisco and Global Compassion and Engagement, she found out about a list of 50 great bhikkhunis that's been passed down in the Khmer, Cambodian tradition, and published in the History of Buddhism 1 and 2. And so just today, the last week or so.
Sorry to interrupt, Ayya, but you said published in the History of Buddhism 1 and 2. So I'm not sure what you're referring to there.
History of Buddhism 1 and 2, published in Khmer, or Cambodian language, through the 5,000 Year Project. That's 5,000 years.org. And so there's a list of 50 there. And I just found that interesting because also, well, I don't know if you can see this here or not, but we've Romanized the Khmer. Some of the forms are the same as what we're used to. Some are a little different. Many of these bhikkhunis are in the Therigatha. Not all of them are. Some of them are in the Theri Apadana. Not all of them are. But I think all of them are familiar to the Pali text tradition. So I just wanted to share this with you because it's just published. And then I wanted to tell you for Sutta Central how useful the resources on Sutta Central have been for this work and related work. So I was actually looking at the list of 50 that's recorded in the Chinese texts. That's how this started. Is I was working on that, and screen share, you can see like just a little bit of working with that, really just for my own study, and also to share with others to be able to see what the connections are between the traditions, and see who we have in common, that kind of thing. So this has come from Sutta Central, as well as being available on CBeta. So I'm not done with it yet, but this is a first part of it there. So I was working with that 50, and then our friend Malai with the Cambodian school said, and guess what? We have a different tradition, another tradition of 50 that's in the History of Buddhism in the Khmer books. And I was just, wow, we think we've unearthed everything, and then you find something else. And how interesting is that?
That is interesting. So then the historian in me immediately asks, are they the same? And are they related? So they're from a common source?
Right. So, this comes together with a lot of notes. And I've been looking at also the similar text of 15 foremost or outstanding bhikkhunis that is passed down in Chinese, classical Han Chinese translation as well. And that's more similar to the list of 13 that we find in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the polytext tradition. And about Bhadda Kundalakesa, or Bhadda Kundalakesa, I just noticed with some interest that in both of those lists, Bhadda Kundalakesa is last. And can you share screen again? And, you know, the reason that I noted this is because she has such an important role in, I mean, her presence is just so strong and so outstanding. And because of the question that you've raised, and others have as well, about whether she was actually the other first bhikkhuni. So if you can scroll down just, oh, actually you're good right there. So here we have the Chinese text, and this is coming off of Sutta Central. If you can scroll down a little further, the way that the Chinese is here, it has kundala. Okay, up a little bit. And then, I don't know if you can see it there, but then it says also the Kusi country in the Chinese. So it says Kundala, it says Bhadda and Kundala, and then the Kusi country. And I thought, what? We're expecting Kundalakesa, and Kesa means hair, and people say that story relates to her hair and her having been a Jain before, and her hair having been like, you know, pulled out by a comb, as some of the Jain monastics still do when they go forth. But just coincidentally, our friend, the intrepid pilgrim Deepak Anand, who is with Xuanzang, Bodhisattva Xuanzang, retracing Bodhisattva Xuanzang project, then at the same time that I was looking at this, then he was also posting about Rajgir, Rajgaha, or Rajagriha. And then he noted that the ancient city of Rajgriha produced excellent quality of scented kusa, or kusi grass, because of which, in the 7th century, Rajagriha was called Kush Agrapur, which means the Kusha city, great Kusha city. And I thought, wow, really? And Bhadda Kundalakesa, or Kundalakesa, is supposed to be from there. And this text says she's from the Kusa, or Kusi country. So I just thought, you know, historically, for those questions that you like to ask, then this brought up a whole bunch of them, because, you know, this is the place of her awakening in the Therigatha, not all of the texts, but in the Therigatha. She's right here where the Buddha is staying in his Vasa number 2, Vasa number 3, before the Bhikkhuni Sangha is said to have been founded with Mahapajapati in the great 500. And in the Therigatha, then there are a number of verses that are located right there in Rajgir that seem like most simple. Some people say like most old. They're going to meditate on Vulture Peak, and it's like they have such a simple life. And I was just envisioning them as, I think you have, as potentially being Bhadda Kundala's companions, who were Jain bhikkhunis, or Jain renunciates, and then met the Buddha. And because of that, then perhaps adhering to the Buddha's teaching, maybe if we look at the Therigatha, then go down further.
Can I comment on that thing about the hair and the grass?
Yes, please, Bhante.
Have you had more to say on that topic, or are we moving ahead? Because if you're moving ahead, I'd like to say something on that.
Go ahead, Bhante.
Okay. So if we can come back to that thing, it's interesting. I wasn't aware of that, so thanks so much for that research.
I wasn't either. I just read it a few days ago.
Now, just a couple of things occur to me when looking at it. First thing is that Kusi and Kesi are obviously very similar, and as are hair and grass. And I wonder whether it's in fact the root is the same word. So we'd have to look up the etymological dictionaries for that. But it seems obvious, right? It seems clear that that's a fairly obvious connection.
Right.
So that's one point. The second point is that, just to note that that reference to Rajagaha as a, Kushagrapur, that's 1200 years after the Buddha.
Right.
So we'd have to look and see whether it's attested earlier or not, but that's one point. But then the other point, which is probably more interesting, is that the first word in Kundalakesa's verses is Luna Kesi, where Kesi is presumably her hair.
Right.
And the word Luna is a bit odd, and it means shorn. I've actually translated it here as moan.
Right. I saw that when I pulled this out today. I saw that.
And look, I translated this some time ago, and I can't 100% remember why I translated it like that, but I was meaning to go back and do it. I mean, I had presumed it was just an idiom, right? Sometimes it's just to fit into the line or something like that. So it's a bit of a quirky idiom. And sometimes when I'm translating, like you want to sort of keep the quirkiness of the verses. Like if she's phrased something in an unusual way, you don't want to sort of smooth things out too much. So, but that's definitely something that I'll review. And I wondered whether I mean, this is purely speculative, but whether even the Kundala and the Luna were perhaps, I'm wondering whether the dialectically there's been some either confusion or perhaps punning on the different senses of these words.
Right.
And it could be a reference to some grass, because, you know, the ascetics used to wear maybe grass girdles or some kind of something. I mean, I could even imagine like wearing a grass like head thing or something. I don't even know. But yeah, the Rajagaha area, of course, we're using the Magadhan dialect, which sometimes causes some ambiguity when it's put into a more formalized Pali form. So it was definitely worth checking the linguistic and historical sources on that one.
Right. And, it may be for a number of our old Bhikkhuni texts in the Pali language, particularly, as you've mentioned, that we have some kind of, I don't know if we could call it interreligious dialogue going on. It might be that quite a lot of language was inherited actually from the Jains because of the Jain Bhikkhuni Sangha pre-existing the Buddhists. And then if people like Bhadda Kundalakesa and others who are recorded in the Therigatha as being at Gijakutta or Gridrakutta on Vulture's Peak for their ascetic abiding in the caves there, as the verses seem to imply, you know, if that's so, and if they were first, and they just changed from being Jain Bhikkhunis to being Bhikkhunis who are followers of the Buddha and awakened in the Buddha's way, then, you know, to bring in the language that they were familiar with from their ascetic life and their ascetic training would seem so normal. And as you've mentioned, so much of the language that's now unique language in the Pali text, Bhikkhuni Vinaya particularly, is shared with the Jains. So I'd check Luna Kesi because I've seen contemporary videos, Bhante, of that, you know, grabbing the hair and like and watch that, and it seems like it should be so painful, and like they've trained for 2 years beforehand to be able to get to that point. And here's the thing about Sikamana also, because the Jains, some of the traditions, even now the women have 2 years of at-home ascetic training before they will actually go forth, where they've undertaken shiksha, and so they've undertaken at-home religious vows. And so we see, like for
Mahapajapati,
but they've undertaken home ascetic vows
Right.
in preparation for going forth. And so it was just coming to mind recently, even for the different tellings of the story of Mahapajapati Gautami's great going forth.
Right.
And whether that period of home asceticism that was recommended by the Buddha in some of the Chinese texts,
Right.
whether that wasn't along pre-existing lines that we know were already established with the Jain Bhikkhunis communities in that area. And if we study even more widely and broadly, we see even centuries later, like in Indonesia, the queen undertaking pabaja at home. We see in the Mulasarvas Devata text, also initially for some of the great bhikkhunis, because they weren't allowed to go forth, like working a kind of a trick, to get in and ordain them at home, even, and then at home practicing ordained, then they become arahantas, display miracles, and then they're allowed to go forth. It's like, okay, obviously, if you're floating up in the air like this, you're not suitable for married life. Venerable sister, and give the blessings to give up on the marriage and be able to go forth. But there's a whole number of texts like that also in the later Sanskrit traditions, in the Avadanas,
and the Jatakas as well.
Right. So, we're looking at something that's not an isolated occurrence.
Right.
And when we look at the things in the broader context, like the greater Indian context, in the interreligious context, especially for the early times between the Buddhists, the Jains, and the other traditions that had gone forth wandering women. Which is acknowledged again and again in the Pali text, that there were women. Yeah.
And, I think that's really interesting. And that's like one of the key things that we can and need to do, is to have that breadth of understanding. Sometimes in the Pali tradition, we have a very deep understanding in the Pali texts, but we lack a broad understanding of the context within which those texts evolved.
Right.
Particularly having better knowledge and understanding of the Jaina practices, I think would be really interesting. I mean, it would be great to have a Buddhist Jain monastic conference in India and get together and talk about all these things, because I'm sure we would learn a hell of a lot. We could try out some of their practices for a while. I'm not
sure. Right.
But yeah, and also just, I think, to notice that like that kind of idea of that more flexible, or the fact that there's more, not necessarily flexible, but that there's more different ways of living the holy life, is also something which has practically been done in Theravadan countries traditionally. And I'm just, one example from my own experience, when we stayed in a monastery called Phunam Kom. It's a very very tip of northeastern Thailand.
Right.
And just around the cliffs from the monastery, there's a cave which they always call Tamme Chi.
Right.
Chi, the nuns' cave.
I remember that.
Yeah. And so that was a wandering ascetic nun who, in the not too distant past, I assume, maybe early 20th century, maybe inspired by Ajahn Mun tradition and so on, had stayed there and made obviously a big impression on the locals.
Right.
So, who was she? I don't know. And what was her life? We don't know. But she's left some memory in the people there.
I was actually just reading something. Someone did their thesis dissertation studying Nirodharam in northern Thailand, and Pra Ajahn Nantayani and the community of Bhikkhunis, which is really flourishing, that she's founded. And I just noticed something in there. I think I was reading this 2 days ago. She mentions also, and this is lore that's been passed down, about one of her teachers then told her that his teacher then was talking about there having been bhikkhunis amongst those who were wandering in the north in past times. So her teacher was then referring about his teacher talking about something that his teacher had passed down. So, but she's told that story a number of times, and she told it also to this researcher, and she told it during a lecture when she was invited to teach a large number of novice monks who are doing formal Buddhist studies in the north, in the Lana area. So then these memories, the memories of the teacher's teacher's teacher and what they said, then are getting passed down in this way. So then there's the sense of connection. The sense of the lineage gets somehow comes close. Right. It doesn't seem so far apart when you can see those steps.
Right. Yeah.
Bhante,
not to get too far apart a stream, but in that part of the world, is the fundamental Buddhism of the Lana Buddhism is through the northern transmission rather than through the southern transmission via Sri Lanka, and the Theravada was introduced later. But they're also closer to, it's probably closer to China than it is to Bangkok, I'm guessing.
Yes, but for Lana, for Theravada, then Lana got their Theravada from Sri Lanka, and this was a big part of like the, not the...
From Sri Lanka rather than from Bangkok, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was direct interchange between the Lana area with Sri Lanka that was not coming via Bangkok.
And
this
that
is
was
a part
like
of the
14th century, is that correct?
Bhante, despite becoming a historian through my study of the Bhikkhunis, I still have a remarkably bad memory for times and dates, but I could find the answer. I could find the answer to that
Never mind.
for you. But Bhante, I wanted to briefly, before we come back to Bhadda Kundalakesa, I wonder if we can briefly talk about one other leading bhikkhuni. When I was looking at the this 15 leading foremost Arahant bhikkhunis text from the Chinese, right, it should be there. Yes, we can screen share that again for you. I just go up a little bit so we can see, no, the other direction, the other up. Okay, there we go. I noticed something interesting here, pause.
Yeah.
And that is that in this text also, Mahapajapati Gautami Theri is first, but surprise, Patachara is second.
Okay.
And she's recognized here not only for her being a great Vinayadhara bhikkhuni, but also for her Dhutanga practice. But the important thing that I wanted to mention here is like the whole concept about the concept of lineage. And here we see, in a way, the way that it came to mind, looking at this, is Mahapajapati as preceptor and Patachara as Vinaya master for bhikkhunis ordinations. Then we think then Kema and Upalawana then come after that in the place we would normally find them. But I just wanted to mention with interest seeing Patachara there in this place, in this text. And she has been appearing to us again and again recently. An image of her was recently inaugurated. This past Vasa during our retreat time was inaugurated at the Insight Meditation Center here in the San Francisco Bay, and then moved to the Insight Retreat Center. And then the first one was made on their request because they wanted to have, from early Buddhism, images of the sacred feminine as part of the images in their center and in their retreat center. Nice. And it's kind of a weird cultural question that came up, like, do the Arahant bhikkhunis qualify as sacred feminine? And I think for early Buddhism, who else? I mean, these great awakened disciples of the Buddha who were female, who else would our sacred feminine be? So, you know, we had some discussion about that, and I was advocating for this, even that they could be called Savika Buddhas. And then the other image here has already now then inspired by the first one, which was commissioned by Insight Retreat Center. Then the second one has gone and is now living in England at Oxford at the temporary Anukampa Vihara. So she's gone to bless Anukampa, and the people's hope for having a Bhikkhuni monastery in England. And then the one below that is the one that is sitting now at our Ranyabodhi Hermitage in California in the Sangha Hall. So they have all just come within the last few months. Nice. And I just realized this also, finding Patachara in the text, as I shared with you in this, you know, somehow much higher up, like just after Mahapajapati. But I just want to come back again relating to Bhadda Kundala, whether Bhadda from Kundalakesa country, or whether Bhadda Kundalakesa, her being at the end of those texts, I just noticed, like with the Garudhammas, I mean, I think it's probably was the last of the Garudhammas to be added in that position, because we find it in some texts as number 1 and some texts as number 8. Okay. And the reason that I say that is because if you do have an oral tradition, then I feel like the easiest place to add something is right at the beginning of a section or right at the end of the section.
Of course, yeah.
And it just leads me to wonder whether if Bhadda Kundala were initially first, but then Mahapajapati came to subsequently be placed as first, then she would become that might explain Bhadda Kundala in her extremely eminent position, then coming to be the last in both of those different tradition texts.
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely a structural phenomenon that we can observe. I mean, the example that comes to mind is the Satya Samyutta, which occurs at the end of the Samyutta Nikaya. And the same thing. I mean, obviously, the Satya Samyutta should be the first Samyutta, and the teaching of the Four Noble Truths and the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta should stand at the beginning of the whole Samyutta Nikaya, which it does in the telling of the first council in the Sarvastivadin version, if my memory serves me well. But in the Pali, then it's been displaced to the end by exactly that phenomenon that you're talking about. You could think, you almost like think of it as like physically having like a series of slips of paper with order, and it's sort of easy enough to sort of swap the top and the bottom pieces while the internal pieces remain the same, and whether it's literal paper or oral recitation. But yeah, definitely can see that. Yeah.
Right. When I was doing the comparative Vinaya studies, like really in depth working with that, then I actually did, I put the things out on the floor of the room, like spread them out in their orders. And, you know, this kind of, I don't know, like patterns kind of thinking or something started to get activated in a way that could be almost like sublime, because I'm normally not much into numbers and mathematics and laying the things out, like, but it's like you start to feel like you're getting insights about like how these things have moved. I hadn't thought about that with the Satya Samyutta, but what a good point.
Actually, Rod Bucknell studied these things. That was where I sort of first picked up that idea from, and he's done some essays on that in the past, on the structure and the way that those things work. It's similar. You can even see a similarity with the Rig Veda. Like the Rig Veda, the first and the last books are the most recent ones.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, the inner books are the older ones, and then it's like the whole thing's sort of wrapped up, and the first and last books are called the unity books, and so that represents where all the different sets of verses were gathered together, organized in one, and then wrapped up
Mm-hmm.
And this is where you get this idea like all the gods are from one God, because actually they're all come from independent sources and they're all brought together and wrapped up.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yes, actually it's all one because they're all one God.
Yeah.
And, so that kind of idea, yeah. So definitely there's something to that.
So
Okay.
we see the traditions doing a lot of work within the traditions over time to like reconcile things. I mean, some more than others, and make them all coherent within that tradition.
Yeah.
And yet then sometimes you get kind of, I don't know, odd ideas that come up in that isolated context, that when you look at them in relationship to what else was going on around that time and space and the various traditions, even various religious traditions like this, then your mind starts to open up and you see, wow, these patterns are happening in this context elsewhere, and it shines a different light on what's happening right here, things that were mysterious, and maybe sometimes we made up our own story, like inside, that then when we open it up, it looks different.
So, I'm conscious that we've been going on for quite some time. We haven't talked about Bhadda's verses yet.
I was thinking the same thing. Shall we look at Bhadda's verses? And I want to ask you.
Yes. But just again, sorry to briefly interrupt there. I think we also haven't explained the context which makes sense of the conversation we've just been having. So for those who are not familiar with it, there's some things in the Bhadda's verses and in her life which suggest that she may have been the earliest bhikkhuni ordained before Mahapajapati. Now, it's a speculative idea. It's not something that we can prove. But it's something which I've sort of talked about and others have talked about. And as you know, it's not the normal position within the tradition. So there are good reasons to reject that hypothesis as well. It's certainly not a sort of, it's not a kind of solid thing, but it's an interesting thing. And so this is why Ayya and I were just discussing this sort of idea of how she came to be at the end of the list rather than at the beginning. But we'll see in her verses what the reasons are for that.
Bhante, so I just wanted to share here. This is an image of artist's image of Bhadda Kundalakesa, and then there's also a screenshot of your chapter, The Other First Bhikkhuni, and your book, Dreams of Bhadda, is here on the screen together. And I'm really interested to know, you wrote this a few years ago, and you were looking into this in depth, and how does it look to you now? Have you learned more that shines new light on this topic?
No, but can we go ahead and read the verses first? Because people still don't have the context. Would you like to read the verses for us, and then we can talk about it?
I actually don't have all the verses available. I've got just a little bit, and we can screen share this. You're welcome to, Bhante.
Can I just I will just do a quick reading just to make sure that everyone's familiar with what we're talking about.
Let me invite you to read this.
Okay, thank you so much. It means a lot that you invite me to do it, because I don't want to be, anyway, forcing my kind of male thing on things. So anyway, so the verses of Bhadda Kundalakesa are found in the Therigatha at verses 5.9 in the Therigatha, and there are 5 verses. The first 3 verses more or less tell her story, and then the second of how she came to be ordained, and then the other 2 are perhaps somewhat separate or independent. So she begins, my hair mown off, covered, and this is my translation, by the way, my hair, or the translation by myself and Jessica Walton. My hair mown off, covered in mud, I used to wander wearing just one robe. I saw fault where there was none and was blind to the actual fault. So in that verse, she's talking about her former time as a Jain ascetic. Leaving my day's meditation on Vulture's Peak Mountain, I saw the stainless Buddha at the fore of the mendicant Sangha. I bent my knee and bowed, and in his presence raised my joined palms. Come, Buddha, he said, that was my ordination. I've wandered among the Angans and the Magadhans, the Vajis, Kasis, and Kosalans. I've eaten the alms food of the nations, free of debt, for 50 years. And just as a passing note, that idiom, free of debt, refers to somebody. It's a sort of a stock idiom in early Buddhism, and it refers to somebody who is an arahant, who's fully enlightened, and who, through their spiritual attainment, has paid off their debt. And the final verse, oh, he has made so much merit, that lay follower is so very wise. He gave a robe to Bhadda, who is released from all ties.
Sadhu.
Okay, so there's the 5 verses of Bhadda Kundalakesa. And this is pretty much this and the statement you just looked at before, where the suttas refer to her as being as Kippa Binyata, the foremost in swiftness of insight. These are pretty much the only really early sources that we have for Bhadda's life. So there's lots of later stories and so on, but the early sources is actually her words herself.
Thank you for sharing that, Bhante, for reading the verse. I just wanted to come back to this part, if you, yes, just here. I'm speaking with tech support, and I've highlighted this part, Kambada, he said, that was my ordination. And so I just wanted to check back in with you about this. And, can you go to the Pali as well? Sutta Central is so great for these things, just to be able to click over to the Pali. And previously I was able to see the 2 of them together, but now somehow with the new Sutta Central, I'm not able to again yet.
You certainly can. I'm seeing that right now in the new Sutta Central.
Really? I wonder
Absolutely.
what I need to do. We don't need to fix it right now, but here we have the Pali as well. It was just 1 click away. I'm just wanting to have it just be all integrated, which I know is possible. Ehi padeti mang awacha sa me asupa sampada. So it definitely says in Pali what it also said in English with Bhante and Jessica Walton's translation. And I had thought that there was only 1 such instance in the Pali text tradition until recently. And I know that Venerable Analeo has done work in finding other instances in other traditions, a whole number of others. And just recently, then I found actually in the Pali text canon, there is 1 more instance. And I thought, wow, what is that? Because I thought the later Pali texts were trying to deny that ever happened. I mean, the Pali text commentators, Dhammapala, then is saying in the commentary to the Therigatha, no, actually it doesn't really mean that. That's not really what happened. It means that the Buddha told her to go to the Bhikkhunis, and then she was ordained with the Bhikkhunis and went forth there. And actually she didn't become an Arahanta right away. Actually she became an Arahanta later, and all these kinds of things. But here is another instance recently.
Do you have the? Sorry, just let me check the Pali. Do you have the number for that one?
Yes, Bhante. I have the Pali just below here, so you can take. I
have the Pali just below. Okay,
right here also. This is just a screenshot from Sutta Central. So it says Upasampadhai Buddho. So wow, and this seems to be in character, perhaps. This is from the Theri Apadana, and some of the content seems to be earlier and some of the content seems to be later, but wow, there's another instance.
Well, it certainly shows that the Theravadan tradition at that point did not believe that the Buddha ordaining nuns directly was impossible, or that it didn't.
Right. Or
that nun, just to be clear, was Panchadayaka Theri. I don't think she's found in the Therigatha. Is that correct?
Panchadipadayika. She offered 5 lamps.
5 lamps, yeah.
And I have yet to check and see there have been some concordance work that's been done with some of the names in the Therigatha and these kind of descriptive epithets that we have in the Theri Apadana, and I have to check and see if she's associated with another name or not. But Bhante, you mentioned the Theravada tradition, and I feel in this case that it's important to acknowledge diversity, not necessarily 100% monolithic, completely unified tradition, but a diversity of voices that are present. And even, with the spread of Buddhist monasticism far and wide, then they didn't have internet and they didn't have Zoom. And they, then brought the teachings the way they learned them through their traditions over time, and then developed.
As we know, now that we do have the internet and Zoom, we can agree about everything. So
right, yes. Thanks for that Aussie humor there. Just to see it seems like in the Theri Apadana, there's a kind of a dialogue happening with some of the other texts. I noticed this with the Mahapajapati Gautami Theri Apadana and the story of the sneeze, which seems to be in dialogue with a different telling that we find in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, Ananda gets seriously dissed for not asking the Buddha to extend his life. And in the Mahapajapati Gautami Theri Apadana, then Mahagautami herself asks the Buddha when he sneezes, blesses him and asks him to have long life. And the Buddha tells her, this is not how you bless a Buddha. This is not how to bless a Buddha. And she asks, how should a Buddha be blessed? And the Buddha said that the Sangha practicing in harmony is the way to bless a Buddha. So she requests him to have long life and extend it. And he says, no. Don't say that. So, this story of the sneeze, then I feel we find the different traditions, even in a way like streams that have different temperatures somehow with regards to particular topics flowing within the same river. But it's like they're in dialogue with each other, but they're not all going 100% the same way. And maybe because they are evolving in different contexts and they have different pressures and different ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Coming up.
That's really interesting. And I mean, that connects that narrative with the wider Mahaparinibbana cycle, which relates to a vast number of suttas, like a number of suttas in the Digha Nikaya, many suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya. All these suttas actually reflect, or in the Vinaya as well, reflect or echo or incorporate aspects of that Mahaparinibbana narrative. Like that narrative, it seems like it had such a powerful emotional resonance that it echoed and was dialogued with. And as you said quite rightly, in that dialogue, and I think one of the, like in that, we see the emergence of a specifically Buddhist approach to historical narrative, where these core events are then used to reflect different perspectives on those events from those different people. And that, in this particular case, this particular case is interesting because it's not just Ananda reflecting to the Buddha and Mahapajapati reflecting to the Buddha, but it's also Ananda reflecting to Mahapajapati. Because their relationship is also interesting, and so the fact that both of them are engaging in a similar way with the Buddha is also, clearly a very kind of deliberate narrative choice, and so very interesting.
Yeah, for myself, also, it's a really different perspective to see this as our ancient and early Sangha members being in dialogue with one another as the Sangha is growing and evolving in various ways in various contexts. And I can only imagine that if we see this reflected in the texts, in the various textual traditions or groups in one way, that has to have been happening in other ways as well.
Right.
And so then if we look at that being within the greater Theravada context, then we see it's not only that contemporarily our Sangha members in different contexts have various views about these things. That's been going on for a while. And they've been in dialogue with one another in various ways that we can actually see reflected in the text for a long time. In ways that ended up then being both agreed upon as canonical. How interesting is that? The ability to hold divergent views within the whole greater tradition.
Yeah, for sure. You asked me a little bit earlier about whether my views on that Bhadda's first ordination thing had changed since I'd written done the research some years ago. Just a simple answer to that is no, it hasn't. I'm aware that Venerable Analayo has published some research on that, but I don't think that sort of substantively affected it. I mean, I think the situation is still that the mainstream position is Mahapajapati was the first bhikkhuni, but it's also true that most of that evidence that puts Mahapajapati at the fore can be traced back to a period perhaps around the Second Council, which is where I would sort of put that sort of shift. And so, as I said before, I don't think it's, but by no means would I say that we can prove that Bhadda was the first bhikkhuni, but I certainly have a strong suspicion that there were bhikkhunis before Mahapajapati, and Bhadda Kundalakesa is probably the best candidate for that. What do you think? What do you think about that?
Even as I've continued to study this over time, and I've been sharing the things that I've been seeing in my studies just recently in these last couple of weeks, I feel like different voices and even a certain amount of discord can be fruitful. And while I think it is historically likely that Bhadda and others were bhikkhunis before Mahapajapati, I can also see, it appears to me, that the story of Mahapajapati Gautami has been used in ways that are both extremely, I'd say, like fruitful and strengthening for the Bhikkhuni Sangha and the role and place of the Bhikkhunis within the greater tradition, and also ways that in past may have been so helpful and useful in past contexts that we now see as problematic. And to just, I'd say, recognize and in a way, like reading faithfully from not only with the mind, but also from the heart. My own sense is that the traditions have largely tried to do their best with the circumstances that they were experiencing. And when we were talking about the 7th century, when we look at that period of time, and just if we take the window of like Mathura, for example, then we can see with the Gunaprabha and the Vinaya Sutra and its auto commentary, we have that record there of what he was talking about related to Bhikkhuni Vinaya. And things that we see in old Bhikkhuni Vinaya, to him in that context, he comments in his contemporary context, then it's like ludicrous. A bhikkhuni, a woman, does not have the autonomy, he says, to be able to order the building of a kuti. This precept he says it makes no sense to him that this precept is there. It has to be a mistake, because his experience then in whether, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th century, around that period of time was like, it's impossible for him to imagine. And yet what his commentary shows for living Bhikkhuni Vinaya in that area at that time, as compared to co-contemporary Jain texts and some other records, we can see that the amount of autonomy that the Buddhists were holding out for the Bhikkhunis and the Bhikkhuni Sangha is like amazing if you compare it to what was going on with the Jain women renunciates situation at that time. But if we compare it to what we see in the polytext in our vision of like early Buddhism and the freedoms that the Buddhist women wanderers and renunciates once enjoyed in very early Buddhism, according to the text, if we take the Bhikkhuni Vibhanga at face value, for example, then the story says they were doing this. They were wandering alone. They were living in the wilderness. They were ordaining women without the ... It says they were doing all these things, and then this precept was made, and then that precept was made, and then the other precept was made. If we take that at face value, then that's the vision that we get. And if we then jump ahead more than 1,000 years, as you said, it's more than 1,000 years, then we see comparatively, I feel like the Buddhists are like trying to do their best as much as they can in that situation where it's not, a woman does not even have enough autonomy to be able to order the building of something, not to mention to do it herself.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, holding out so much more in terms of the Bhikkhuni Sangha's autonomy. And I then asked the question, if I read faithfully, intellectually and also from my heart, and I see that's what the Buddhist tradition was doing, this is how it appears to have evolved over more than 1,000 years. I also ask myself the question, reading faithfully and working with the traditions faithfully from my mind and heart, then what does that speak to us about what we can and even should do now in this context, in these circumstances, if we glean the underlying values? Should evolution go one way only, when in the gendered context in the Buddha's time, it appears that the women were able to have so much more, I mean, Buddhist bhikkhunis and Jain bhikkhunis and other kinds of wanderers and all of that, if they were able to do those things, but then the cultures really stopped allowing it. But now the culture allows much more again in some places. Then what does that mean for us?
In some places, and it's not, and I mean, a couple. First thing is, yes, and I think that idea of reading faithfully, I think one of the how do I put this? One of the fundamental paths to understanding in trying to appreciate an ancient text and an ancient culture is that we have to begin with an assumption of good faith. And if we begin with an assumption of cynicism and an assumption of corruption and an assumption of, undermining people, then we're not. It's not merely that it's emotionally a negative way of looking at it, but more importantly, that it's unrealistic because people aren't like that. Most people, most of the time, especially in the spiritual movement, are trying to do the right thing, and we have to relate to them in that way. And of course, that's not always the case. It doesn't mean excusing people, but it's to recognize that people who try to do the right thing sometimes fail, or sometimes do the wrong thing, or sometimes make mistakes, as do we. And all of these issues, like you're saying, like issues of the autonomy of women and these things, are not linear or simple. And we think that we're good today, and in many ways, of course, we have made progress in some areas, but it's still very far from adequate or even kind of rational. I mean, in Australia, we're currently undergoing a massive Me Too crisis in our federal parliament. Regarding the treatment of women and so on, and it's one of these things. The more you realize, it's not just that there are problems in religion. It's not just that there are problems in Hollywood. It's not just that there are problems in governments. There are problems everywhere, and this is, as long as we are not fully respecting all human beings, then we are going to be generating these kinds of problems and issues. The important thing, I think,
Thank you for mentioning that, Bhante.
The important thing is that where are we going? Like, we need to be taking a step forward, and we can't find perfection, but we can improve things. And I think if we look at the context of Buddhism historically, then we can see that Buddhism was about taking steps forward relative to the wider context. And I think we can see that in the early text and in later times as well. I'm reminded of some of the writings, the early records of, I think, by some of the women in the colonial era who wrote about the position of women in different Asian countries. And they essentially that they concluded that the places where women generally had the best situation were the Buddhist countries, Sri Lanka, right, and so on. And again, I don't want to say that there's a obvious and one-to-one relationship here, because the relationship between a religion and a culture is complex. But still, I think that it's important for us not to judge people in the past by our standards, especially not by our imagined standards of what we think that we are, as opposed to what we actually are, which is usually...
That's such a big one right there. Oh.
Usually something quite different again. Yeah.
Yes. So engaging with the context in a liberating way.
Yeah. And that whole thing about that traveling and so on, and of course that one of the really kind of outstanding context here is Bhadda Kundalakesa's verses themselves, where she and what really strikes me about her verses is how bold she is. And she's just completely out there. She's just like, this is what I did. And I wandered among the Ungans and the Magadans, the Vajis, Kasis, and like, for those of you who don't know, that basically means across the whole of the sort of northern Indian Gangetic plain. And, she spent her whole life for 50 years. I mean, can you imagine that? That's simply the physical endurance to be able to do that. I mean, just barefoot, taking a bowl, wandering across all of these countries, and seeking alms food in all of those different places. I mean, we here at Lokanta, we still follow the alms food practice, but we just have to walk down the road to Wigram Street, and we have all of the food from all of those different parts of India available in our own little India street down here. So we're much more lucky. Bhadda Kundalakesa had to travel to all the different regions to get all the different regional delicacies. Right. But that amazing just strength and courage and just straightforwardness with which she says this, and the same thing with that last verse. I find that such a bold verse, right? She's there celebrating how much merit this man has made by giving things to her.
Yes.
And not kind of dismissing it or apologizing for it or minimizing it all, saying, yes, you have made lots of merit because you gave it to me.
It's classic Buddhism, in fact, indeed, but this part has gotten so turned upside down,
right?
Somehow, with the absence of the Bhikkhuni Sangha and various teachings on karma.
Can I just say thank you so much for that? It's
Thank
been
you,
wonderful.
Bhante.
I feel like
we've
talked about so many interesting things. We should have talked about Bhadda some more, but anyway, maybe another time. But anyway, and I've learned so much from discussing with you, as I always do. So this is very, very wonderful to hear.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Anumodami. Well said, well said.